So for our next example, this is again the same idea. It's presented to us in a non-factored form, so we do have to make sure to factor it. So again, we need it equal to 0, so this -8 that's over here needs to be moved to the other side so that we can factor this guy. So we're going to add 8 to both sides. Definitely the easiest movement to make since all of my other terms were already over here on the right hand side. So I've got 10x squared minus 13x minus 9 equals 0. So now we have that equal to 0 that we have to have in order to be able to solve this guy. And we're going to do our factoring. Now I'm going to use the bottoms up method. Hopefully you watched my video in the factoring section on bottoms up, so this isn't anything crazy or different for you. If you haven't watched that, you might go back and watch that again to make sure you're understanding what we're doing. But remember, for the bottoms up, we're going to take the term in front of our x squared and we're going to bring it back to our constant and we're going to multiply those together. So this is going to be x squared minus 13x minus 90. And I'm actually going to ignore my equal to 0 for right now because that's just way too much stuff to write down. I'm just going to work on factoring this out, and then we'll bring that equal to 0 back once we've got it in the right format. Okay, well now I need to factor this guy. So I'm going to do my 2 parentheses because I've got a leading coefficient of 1 now. I know that I'm going to start off with an x and an x. I need 2 numbers that multiply to -90, and they need to add to -13. Now I want to talk about our signs real quick for a second. Since I'm multiplying to a negative, that is telling me I have opposite signs. One's negative, one's positive. That's what that particular negative is telling me. This negative is telling me that my larger number is my negative number. Okay, so because I know those two things, I can start kind of really looking at the factors. And when I start doing stuff like this, especially when I've got such a large number like 90, I just kind of start somewhere. Doesn't really matter where you start, we just got to get going. And so for me, the first thing I look at this is I think 90 and -10, and I went ahead and made my 10 negative because I know my larger number has to be the -1. But when I add those together, that gives me -1, so that's totally not going to work. But it gives me some direction. I know that this is way too small, and this is kind of counterintuitive, but if this is too small, I need to go smaller than 9. So I start thinking, okay, I need to be smaller than 9, still divide into 90. My next guess was 5. I thought, we'll see what 5 does, because I know 5 will divide into 90 because it ends in a 0, and this actually came out to 18, and if I make that a -18, again, because my larger number is negative, when I add those, I get that -13. All of a sudden, there's my pair of numbers. Okay, so in my parentheses here, I'm going to have a +5 and a -18. But remember, I'm not done yet. And this is the thing you cannot forget to do when you're doing bottoms up, is remember up here I multiplied by 10. Well, now I need to divide that 10 out. I need him gone from my problem. Okay, now I can't divide 10 into 5, but I can reduce it. Here we can divide out a 5 top and bottom, and that is going to get me x plus 1/2. And I'm going to, over here, we're going to divide out a 2, again, top and bottom, reducing them as much as possible. And this is going to give me x minus 9/5. And then, here's our bottoms up. We're going to take our 2, bring him up in front of our x, which is going to give us 2x plus 1. We're going to take the 5 and bring him up in front of our x, which is going to give us 5x minus 9. And remember, this is still equal to 0. You've got to bring down that equal to 0, because all we've done right now is our second step of our problem. Remember, we have 4 steps. It has to be equal to 0. We have to factor, and then we have to set each factor to 0. and then we have to solve each of those equations. We've only gotten to the second one. We've factored this question out. So now we need to keep going, and we need to take each one of these and set them equal to 0. So let's get a little bit more paper here for just a second. And we're going to take this 2x plus 1, and we're going to set it equal to 0. And we're going to do the same thing for the 5x minus 9. We're going to set that equal to 0. So now if we come in here and we solve each one of these equations here, we're going to subtract 1 from both sides. So 2x equals -1. We're going to then divide both sides by 2. And so our x equals -1/2. And there's our first answer. But again, we still got to do this guy. So we've got to add 9 to both sides. 5x equals 9. Take that and divide both sides by 5. And our second answer is x equals 9/5. So there's our two distinct answers for our problem. Okay, so for our next problem, again, we are going to solve by factoring, and we do have quite a big numbers on this one, so it'll take us a little bit to factor it, but we can do it. Again, remember that in order to solve by factoring, the first thing that has to happen is we have to be equal to 0. So right now we're sitting here with this 29x plus 5 over here on the right-hand side, and we need to move both of those over here to the left. So what we want to do is come over here and subtract the 29x and subtract the 5, so we can do this all at the same time. I'm going to move those over here to the left-hand side as well. Now I stacked them this way because I don't have a whole lot of room on the left-hand side, but I want you to remember that I can't actually add any of these together because they are all different. They're not like terms. So when we write this out, we're going to write out our 42x squared minus 29x minus 5, and now it's going to be equal to 0 because both the 29x and the 5 that were over here on the right hand side are both gone, and we've got that equal to 0 that we need in order to solve this problem. So now our second step, if you'll remember, is to factor. So again, I'm going to use that bottoms up method that we talked about earlier. So if you haven't watched that, I would highly suggest going and looking at that particular method. So we're going to bring back that 42 and multiply it times the 5. Finish 29x, 2 and 10. So quite a big number there, but we're going to the factors of that number. Now over here we need to multiply to -210, and we need to add to -29. Again, just to remind yourself how the signs work. Since this is negative, our signs are going to be opposite. Since this is also negative, our larger number is negative. Okay? It just kind of gives you an idea of where to start and where to go from there. So let's look at this 210. Now, typically when I get something like this that's such a large number, I just say I think that's 210, and since it ends in a 0, I would use 21 and 10. Remember up here we said our larger number was negative, so we're going to make this a -21. Now that gives me -11, and that is not what I need, so I'm going to cross that out. When this number is too small, that means that we need to go smaller than 10, but still divide into the 2110. So, well, if 10 doesn't work, I know that 5 to that, so I can look at 5 and say, okay, well, 5 and -32, that gives me -210, but when I do that, that gives me -37, so that one is too large. That means I know that my factor lives somewhere between 5 and 10, so there's only so many options you could do. You have 6, 7, 8, 9. So there's 4 numbers, so we can just start at 6 and work our way up and see. So it would be 6 and -35. And when you subtract that, you do get -29, so there's our set of factors.
So you kind of see how that works. You just, when you're finding something, especially with such a large number, you just need to start somewhere and then work your way logically through the problem or through the numbers to check to see. And if you're not sure if something divides into that, take out your calculator and divide it out. It's much better to be certain than to say that there's no factors when there actually is. Okay, so we're going to use those two factors. We're going to break this down. It's going to be x plus 6 and then x minus 35. And remember, it doesn't matter which one goes first or second as long as they're both there. But also remember, we need to divide this by that 42 that we multiplied by earlier. So on 6 over 42, we can reduce that by 6. So I'm going to divide out a 6, top and bottom, and that is going to give me x plus 1 over 7. I'm going to do the same thing for the 35 over 42. I can divide out a 7 on both of those. So this is going to give us x minus 5 over 6. And then we're going to bring those bottoms up, and we will be done with our factoring. So we're going to bring that 7 up in front of our x. We're going to bring the 6 up in front of our x for that second one, and we're going to have 7x plus 1 times 6x minus 5 equal to 0. So now we've done our step 2. We factored it out into our two parentheses, and we're on to our last two steps, which is to actually do the solving and find out what x is. So remember, what we're going to do is we're going to take each factor, so the 7x plus 1, and we're going to set that equal to 0. And then we're going to take the 6x minus 5 and do the same thing. 6x minus 5 equals 0. And then all we have to do is solve each one of these equations. So for the 7x plus 1, we're going to subtract 1 from both sides. That's going to give us 7x equals negative 1. And then we're going to divide both sides by 7. And we're going to get x equals negative 1 over 7. So there's our first answer. We're going to do the same thing for the 6x minus 5. So we're going to add 5 to both sides. So 6x equals 5. Divide both sides by 6. And our second answer is going to be x equals 5 over 6. Now remember, when you're doing your homework, that it actually does everything in two parts. And I know I haven't really talked about this up until this point. Remember that your first part of your homework is to do this part where you're doing the factoring. It wants us to put both of these parentheses in. And then the second part is to actually place these two answers into the system. So make sure you're putting in the correct steps for each part.